Am I suspected of something?
Step out. Don't make this difficult.
You're escalating for no reason.
You can feel it in your chest before you can explain it. The moment a routine stop stops being routine. The moment the question isn't what you did wrong, but whether you'll be allowed to be treated like a person long enough to prove you did nothing wrong. Just after 9:40 p.m. on a warm Thursday, a silver sedan rolled through the west side of Brookhaven, a mid-sized city that liked to describe itself as quiet, family-friendly, improving. The car wasn't speeding. It wasn't swerving. Its taillights worked. The driver didn't run a red light. The only thing wrong about it, at least the only thing that would matter in the next 20 minutes, was that there were 2 black women inside it, coming back from a late grocery run and a pharmacy stop. The driver was a registered nurse finishing a swing shift. The passenger, and the one who would become the center of the storm, was her older cousin, an assistant federal public defender who spent her weekdays standing next to people nobody else wanted to stand next to. She was exhausted in a way that didn't show on the face because her job had trained her to look calm while everything around her was trying to provoke a reaction. At 9:41 p.m., a patrol unit pulled out from a side street and tucked in behind the sedan. Less than a minute later, the overheads flashed. This is where, in most people's minds, the story should be simple. Pull over, provide license and registration, take the warning or ticket. Go home. But the outlier stories, the ones that travel, always begin with the same invisible ingredient. A decision made quickly by the person with the badge, that the situation will be handled with dominance instead of professionalism. And dominance, once it shows up, rarely stays contained. The stop began with the officer approaching on the passenger side, not the driver's. That detail matters later. The body-worn camera would eventually show the officer's flashlight lingering not on the driver's hands, not on the center console, but on the passenger's face. Then her lap. Then back to her face again, as if the goal wasn't safety, but appraisal. The officer identified the reason for the stop as a lane integrity concern. In plain language, he said the car drifted. The driver, hands on the wheel, apologized and offered her license. The officer took it, but kept his focus on the passenger. Less than a minute into the encounter, he demanded the passenger's ID. The passenger didn't raise her voice, and she didn't insult him. She didn't call him names. She asked a question that, in a normal society, would be unremarkable. Why? That question, why do you need my ID, became the spark. Because once an officer takes the position that compliance itself is the test, any request for a legal basis sounds like defiance. And once the officer decides a passenger's curiosity is defiance, he can justify almost anything as failure to cooperate. At 9:43 p.m., the officer repeated the demand, sharper. The passenger asked again whether she was suspected of a crime. The officer said he didn't have to explain. The driver tried to interject, to smooth it over, to offer her own documentation again. The officer cut the driver off with a hand gesture and a command to remain silent. The passenger's posture stayed controlled, but inside her head, she was doing what lawyers do automatically, mapping what was happening onto what the law actually allows. A passenger is not the driver. In many jurisdictions, a passenger can be asked for identification under specific conditions. When there is reasonable suspicion, the passenger is involved in criminal activity. When the passenger is being issued a citation, when the officer needs the information for a legitimate, safety-related purpose, or when local law explicitly authorizes it under defined circumstances. But a blanket demand, ID, because I said so, sits on shaky ground. And shaky ground is exactly where bad stops turn into lawsuits. At 9:44 p.m., the officer ordered the passenger to step out. From the outside, that sounds like a minor escalation. In reality, it's a threshold. Once you're outside the vehicle, you've been separated. You're easier to control, easier to search, easier to detain, and if the officer wants, easier to frame as a threat. The passenger complied with the physical instruction. She stepped out. She did not comply with the narrative. She kept her hands visible. She stood near the curb. The officer angled his body to place himself between her and the car, creating a physical barrier that made the driver's presence feel irrelevant. The body cam would later capture how quickly the stop's reason disappeared and a new purpose took over: forcing submission. At 9:45 p.m., the officer announced he was going to pat her down for weapons. The passenger had on leggings and a light jacket. No bulky pockets, no bag, no movement that would suggest concealment. The officer didn't articulate any specific safety concern. It was a power move dressed up as procedure. The passenger did not resist, but she asked, calmly, what the justification was. That's the moment you can feel the video's eventual comment section forming, because audiences recognize the pattern even if they can't name it. When the person being policed is calm and the person doing the policing is the one whose emotions are rising, the roles look inverted. The authority looks fragile, and fragile authority often turns punitive. At 9:46 p.m., the officer's tone sharpened again. He moved closer. He angled his flashlight directly into her eyes. And then, in a sequence that would later be replayed frame by frame, he grabbed her wrist to reposition her hands. The body cam audio caught a quick inhale from the passenger, not fear exactly, but the controlled shock of someone realizing the officer has decided to make physical contact for no legitimate reason. The driver, still seated, asked what was happening. The officer ignored her. At 9:47 p.m., the officer told the passenger she was being detained for obstruction. Obstruction is one of those charges that can mean everything or nothing depending on who is writing the report. In theory, it exists to prevent people from interfering with legitimate police work. In practice, in too many places, it becomes a catch-all label for "you didn't make me feel powerful enough." Within seconds, the passenger's wrists were cuffed behind her back. No punching, no kicking, no dramatic chase. Just a quiet, controlled use of force that for viewers reads as more unsettling than chaos. Because if the officer can do this to someone calm, someone polite, someone who is clearly not dangerous, then what is the limiting principle? At 9:49 p.m., the officer walked the handcuffed passenger toward the patrol unit. Here, the pacing of the story matters. Competitor outliers keep retention by stacking now-wait moments, each one small but irreversible. The ID demand, the step-out order, the pat-down, the wrist grab, the cuffs, each step closes a door behind the person being detained. Each step makes the audience wonder, how far will this go before someone stops it? At 9:50 p.m., the officer placed the passenger in the back seat. The driver, now alone in the sedan, was asked questions that had nothing to do with lane drift and everything to do with justifying what had just happened. Was the passenger on probation? Did she have drugs? Was she known to police? Was there anything in the car the officer should know about? The driver said no. She said the passenger was her cousin. She said they were heading home. Then the driver did something that would later be described as either brave or foolish, depending on who was watching. She asked for a supervisor. A request like that can de-escalate if the department culture values professionalism, or it can pour gasoline if the culture values loyalty to the officer on scene. At 9:54 p.m., a second unit arrived. The supervisor did not immediately undo the detention. That's another piece audiences notice, the unwillingness to contradict the first officer in real time. In many departments, the first priority becomes protecting the narrative, not correcting the mistake. And the longer the detention continues, the harder it becomes to admit it was unjustified. The passenger remained cuffed in the back seat. From inside the car, her voice, muffled through the partition, was calm. She did not beg. She did not scream. She stated clearly that she was a federal public defender and that she was not required to provide identification absent suspicion. She offered to provide her bar card. She offered to provide her work ID. She offered to provide her name for documentation. What she would not do was validate the officer's claim that he could demand anything without explanation. The supervisor asked the first officer what the probable cause was. The first officer said the passenger refused lawful commands. That phrase, refused lawful commands, became the hinge of the entire case. Because it sounds like a conclusion, it is, in fact, the question. Were they lawful commands, or were they unlawful demands? At 9:58 p.m., the supervisor requested dispatch run the passenger's name. The passenger provided her name and date of birth. Dispatch confirmed she had no warrants, no criminal record, no outstanding citations, nothing. At this point, a professional stop ends. An apology is given. The cuffs come off. A supervisor documents the incident as a training opportunity. Everyone goes home. But that is not what happened, because the first officer had already committed himself publicly on camera to a narrative that the passenger was obstructing. If he removed the cuffs now, he would be admitting he was wrong. And admitting he was wrong would mean facing the thing many officers fear more than lawsuits: looking weak. At 10:02 p.m., the officer decided to search the vehicle. The driver objected. The officer claimed consent. The driver said she did not consent. The officer said he had probable cause based on behavior. Behavior is not probable cause, not by itself, not in any meaningful sense, but in the friction between what the law says and what the street allows, behavior becomes a blank check. The body cam captured the officer shining his light into grocery bags, opening a pharmacy receipt, lifting items like they were evidence of something. Nothing illegal appeared. But the search itself served a purpose. It communicated dominance, and it delayed the moment of accountability. At 10:08 p.m., a third unit arrived. Now the street had become a stage. 3 patrol cars, multiple uniforms, 1 handcuffed passenger, 1 driver trying to remain composed. A small crowd beginning to gather at a distance, drawn by the lights. At 10:10 p.m., the supervisor made the decision that would later haunt him. He allowed the detention to continue and framed it as investigatory. Investigatory of what? There was no crime. And that's where the story pivots from an ugly stop into something with consequences. Because once a detention continues without basis, the paper trail begins to matter. The radio logs, the CAD timestamps, the body cam footage, the supervisor's later explanation. All of it becomes discoverable. All of it becomes evidence. At 10:14 p.m., the passenger was removed from the back seat and brought to the curb, still cuffed. A field interview form was filled out. The officer wrote that she was agitated. The body cam would later show that word did not match reality. Words like agitated, uncooperative, or combative. These are the invisible weapons of policing. They can justify force, justify detention, justify arrest, even when the video shows calm. And in the era of viral footage, the gap between the words and the reality is what creates outrage. At 10:16 p.m., the supervisor asked whether there were any departmental policies about demanding ID from passengers. The first officer insisted there were. He said passengers were required to identify themselves upon request. That was not correct in the way he stated it, and it mattered, because policy is not the same as law. And even if a policy exists, it must be constitutional. A department cannot policy its way around rights. At 10:18 p.m., the passenger's cuffs were removed. No apology, no acknowledgement, just a quiet undoing, as if the last 30 minutes had been a normal inconvenience, and the driver was given a warning for lane drift. And then the officers left. If the story ended here, it would still be infuriating, but it wouldn't be an outlier. Outliers become outliers when the aftermath exposes something bigger. 2 days later, the passenger filed a formal complaint with Internal Affairs. Her complaint was not emotional. It was clinical. It identified the time of stop, the unit number, the officer's name and badge number, the supervisor's identity, and the precise actions she alleged were unlawful. Demand for passenger ID absent reasonable suspicion, unjustified pat-down, unlawful detention, retaliatory handcuffing, and a vehicle search without valid consent or probable cause. A week after that, she requested the body cam footage. The department denied the request. I'm citing an ongoing investigation. That denial is often the moment these stories explode, because it creates the impression of a cover-up. Whether the denial was legal or not, the optics were terrible. So the passenger's attorney, someone who understood that optics and law travel together now, filed a public records lawsuit. The department released the footage 3 weeks later. And when it hit the internet, it moved with the same velocity you've seen in 100 other outlier clips, stitched into short segments, reposted with captions, debated by commentators, slowed down frame by frame, and compared against state law. Within 48 hours, the clip reached local news. Within a week, it reached national commentary. And because the passenger was a federal public defender, the story had a built-in narrative twist. She wasn't someone who needed the system to save her. She was someone who knew exactly how the system had just been used against her. The city manager asked for a briefing. The police chief issued a statement that used the familiar language of institutional self-protection. The department took the matter seriously. The incident was under review. The department was committed to fairness. But statements don't outrun video. Then came the second twist, the supervisor's body cam. Because the first officer's footage showed escalation. The supervisor's footage showed acquiescence. It showed the moment a leader had the chance to stop it, and chose, instead, to protect the officer's pride. The passenger filed a federal civil rights lawsuit under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, alleging unlawful seizure and retaliation for asserting rights and failure to supervise. Again, this is written as a fictional reenactment, but the legal framework is real, and that realism is what gives the script its weight without pretending the case actually occurred. The discovery process revealed what these cases often reveal: patterns. Not necessarily a smoking gun email, not necessarily explicit slurs. Something more damning because it's more common. Complaints that never went anywhere. The first officer had multiple prior citizen complaints alleging unnecessary escalation during traffic stops. Each complaint was marked "not sustained," the classification that sounds neutral but often means we can't prove it, even when the only reason you can't prove it is because nobody bothered to try. And the supervisor had prior notes about command presence issues, which is departmental language for a leader who manages by force rather than judgment. The city, faced with mounting legal risk, entered settlement discussions. The settlement number became the headline because numbers are shareable. The city agreed to pay $1.25 million total, structured as $650,000 in direct compensation to the passenger, $250,000 in attorney's fees, and the remainder earmarked for policy reforms and independent auditing. But the money wasn't the story. Money is what institutions pay when they want the story to end. The story was what the settlement required the city to admit, without admitting, that the stop was indefensible. The reforms were specific. They weren't vague promises, they were enforceable terms. First, the department adopted a written policy clarifying that passenger identification requests must be tied to articulated suspicion or legitimate investigative need. and that refusal alone does not constitute obstruction. Second, the department updated training to include a dedicated module on retaliatory policing, what it looks like, how it happens, and why it exposes the city to liability. Third, supervisors were required to document, in writing, the justification for continued detention when a citizen had been handcuffed but no arrest was made. The goal was simple: make it harder to hide unjustified restraints behind vague language. Fourth, the department agreed to publish quarterly demographic data on traffic stop outcomes, searches, detentions, handcuffing without arrest, broken down by race, age, and neighborhood. Data is uncomfortable for departments that survive on anecdote. But data is also the thing you can't argue with when it keeps repeating the same pattern. Then the discipline came. The first officer was terminated. The supervisor was demoted. And the city paid. If you want the emotional arc to land, this is where you let the audience exhale. Then you give them the broader point. Because the passenger, in interviews after the settlement, did not frame herself as uniquely wronged. She framed herself as lucky. Lucky because she knew the law. Lucky because she had resources. Lucky because the video existed. And if she was lucky, what did that say about everyone else? That's what makes this kind of story shareable. Not the outrage alone, the recognition. The sense that the line between normal life and humiliation is thinner than we want to admit. The final beat is always the same question, asked indirectly. If a calm passenger can be cuffed for asking why, what is the rule? And if the rule is that authority must never be questioned, what exactly are people supposed to do when authority is wrong? By the end of the case, the passenger had done what she always did. She turned an individual violation into a systemic argument. Not by yelling, not by grandstanding, by documenting, by filing, by forcing the institution to put its decisions on paper. And the city, quiet, improving, family-friendly Brookhaven, learned the expensive version of a lesson it could have learned for free. You don't have to use a slur for the outcome to be discriminatory. You just have to treat rights like an inconvenience and questions like a threat. The video that went viral didn't show a chase